Good evening. This is the question and answer portion of session 16, the last session of this conference. My name is Eric Marks, and I am the MC for this live stream. Enrico, in your research, when you say they switched from freehand to bipolar or anvil percussion to continue reduction stages, why do you think they switched when the core is smaller, if it is still possible to use freehand?
Yes, thank you for the question. We say that there is a switch in the napping techniques because we saw in the archaeological record that there were some selection for blanks for a specific type of instrument, manufactured instrument or artifact. Especially we saw a difference between knives or cutting instruments and scrapers. And what we saw is that the difference is related to blanks for cutting instruments were thinner. So that type of blanks were very difficult to obtain by freehand percussion. So our hypothesis was that this switch were for an election made by antique nappers to obtain that type of blanks that could prepare that type of instrument with sharp bevels. That was the original problem that we face when we start to saw the archaeological record. By the experimental analysis, we tried this and we found that those type of blanks were obtained, making this switch when cores were smaller enough to try to use bipolar napping, but still be used by or reduced by the freehand percussion. But the option or the election were because of that.
Okay, thank you. Is Camilla and Roxana on? The question is, I like that you decided to group all those three categories in one, since they are not really that different. And I can imagine how some artifacts would not be perfectly classified in any one of those three. But I like the idea of the use of those tools as roughing tools used in percussion, and not just simple scrapers, as we usually see them in publications. Have you tried using it to modify deer antlers?
No, because we don't have in the archaeological records this kind of things in Argentina, in this part of the world. So we only use this for bones.
It says the different pattern and frequencies regarding polishing, microfractures, crushing, and rounding that you observed in gouges, chisels, and cold chisels, were these expected?
Yes, they were. Because this kind of micro wear use traces usually are associated with hard materials that work. So is in these three different kind of use, with these three different gestures of use are generating the same kind of patterns, and we were expecting that and we found that.
Thank you. Deborah, were the quartz pebbles used for the experiment from the archaeological quarries mentioned in your presentation?
Yes, all the pebbles used were collected near the archaeological sites, and they all have some characteristic of use in the past by this population that we are studying.
Okay, good. Follow up, is it correct that the high fragmentation in vein quartz napping areas were found on the archaeological settlement sites and not in the quarries?
The fragmentation rate for both archaeological material and experimental material were very similar. We found that around 60–70% were fractured. We think that there is a very high percentage of fragmentation in quartz material, but maybe it could be related to the different type of quartz that we are analyzing in this zone. We found hyaline and milky quartz. Sometimes the fragmentation rate are different in those cases.
Thank you. Marissa, since you were able to identify two types of points, have you considered giving names for these types? I guess it would be easier for other researchers to refer to them, especially if they find the same technological pattern elsewhere. And And another topic, I'm so jealous that obsidian can be found in Argentina because there is no sources in Brazil for us to play with.
There is a lot of variability, although there are two large general types, let's say, one that's long and stem and narrower, and the other one triangular and smaller. But there is more variability, perhaps among the smaller ones. I don't think we have enough now to undertake that kind of type characterization. I know from the question from the chat that there was a suggestion of doing statistical analysis and, to define types. So that's, of course, very interesting as an avenue. Also because we haven't done it because we are still trying to assess the level of similarity with other sites, and also because we are reluctant to adjudicate names that might actually simplify the diversity that we see. But that doesn't mean that we are reluctant to look into that in the future.
Yes, thank you. Jose, were the oven temperatures measured in the active fire and after the ashes were removed? Would you please tell me if there are any taphonomic studies observing changes in the bones of faunal remains after being cooked in this type of oven?
Okay, this is really quite a slow cook method, and it's quite gentle. And so if you're thinking about heat damage on bones that really leave strong marks, then you're thinking about things like roasting or bits where you're really exposing some of those bones to the flames. It's a bit like doing a slow cook. So when you do it right, the meat just falls off the bones and it is so good. So I don't think it would have strong traces on the bones.
Thank you. Luigi, first of all, congratulations on the initiative of making these experiments with axes. You only mentioned the flaked axes from the Aratu culture, but we know that Amerindian groups produce much more polished than flaked axes. So my question is, aren't there also polished axes in the Aratu culture? And if they exist, couldn't the flaked axes be just a preform for the polished ones?
So his answer is that he doesn't believe that they are preforms. They are actually finished like that, flaked axes. And he thinks that because of this site that presents 500 blades that have no polishing at all. So even for the other sites where they have some hundreds of axe blades, they have no evidence at all of polishing, just flaked axes with use marks.
We have a question for Mercedes. Do you find that new students are enthusiastic to learn more about experimental archaeology, or is it something that you have to persuade them to try?
Well, I guess that nobody needs to be persuaded to try and have fun with rocks. Well, that's my opinion. But the thing is that it takes a while for the students and the colleagues to realize that learning flint knapping is a sort of mid to long-term commitment, right? So you have to also study a lot of the theory behind it, and you have to practice, and you have to have the materials. And also it's, at least from my point of view, it's quite important to have other colleagues to practice together, to have someone to help you when you get stuck at some point. So I don't think that students or colleagues, they need to be really persuaded to break rocks, but they also have to know that this is something that you don't learn in 5 minutes, and you have to be dedicated and dedicate your time to learn.
All right, and a follow-up. It says, at the moment, your institute seems to be focused on lithic and bone technology. Do you plan to expand on to other technologies in the future?
I'm not sure. That really depends on people who could be interested in, for example, working with pottery. But then I also know that this demands, structure and special labs or equipment to do that properly. I believe that at my lab, we're pretty sure open to most of the ideas, even the craziest ones. So the thing is that well, for historical reasons and for special interests in terms of what I'm mainly interested in studying, we began with the lithics, and then we expanded to the bone tools, mostly because of my PhD student, Gabriela. And so, well, I would never say never. It really depends on having collaborations and people interested in doing that.
Good, thank you so much. JC, considering how many previous assumptions about lithic technology you disproved through your project, do you have any future plans for similar projects using experimental archaeology to ask new questions about old collections?
I'm still working with some lithic points from southern Brazil, expanding all this big territory of Brazil. But the idea is also apply this in other thermal artifacts and also compare flakes, like we did in the article of XArc in 2019, which was just more focused, but now expanding this. So also for what we call lesmas, which is a thermal artifact from what people are calling here Itaparica tradition, Itaparica industry, and also some very specific types of bifacial tools from southern Brazil that they were called autopara, which are some bifaces that are very similar with what someone could look at them and call them like an Acheulean handex, because they're so similar, but also some that we are calling boomerangoides, which are bifaces that they really look like boomerangs. So we're also planning to make experimentations on this to better understand these technologies and make these comparisons in statistical terms.
Follow-up, it says the bone that you used was weathered and showed evidence of some splitting when you napped it in your experiment. Can you speak a bit about how your results might differ if you were to nap bones which were not weathered or have been treated in different ways?
So answer the question. I don't know. I will try use maybe a fresh bone to compare the results, but it's a future project. I'm working on it.
This follow-up was, why did you decide to use percussion rather than the groove and split method to make these bone tools?
Because we don't have any mark on the bones that tell us that people used some instrument to make marks before the cracked bone, the break bone. So I thought that split the bone with a hammerstone could be the right way to make this experiment. The artifacts in Brazil are different that we found in other countries, for example. So I try another way.
Okay, thank you so much. Felipe, do you take as a relevant aspect from the distance from raw material sources? You said that are present locally, but there are any difference in it present in the presence in the landscape?
Yes, there are distinctive differences between the location on the micro landscape, the area surrounding the sites. For example, in two of the sites, you can find abundant presence of volcanic rocks, including natural quarries and areas where some of the raw material comes in shapes that are really, really similar to overall morphometry and volumetry of the finished tools, especially regarding larger tools. But while the cherts and the quartz, they're mostly found on riversides. I believe it's one of the reasons because they, geologically speaking, they're not present abundantly on the surface as the volcanic rocks, the way they are formed. So the river, as it cuts through the landscape, it brings them forward and they accumulate on these pebble beaches that are commonly found on the curves of the rivers. I hope that answers the question.
It does. Thank you so much. Now, follow up, can you tell us more about the limitations of using historical records to base your experiments?
Yes, there are a few, especially regarding the one of the aspects of Southern J research is that a lot of the known Southern J groups which have been written about are Kaingang and Xokleng, when there are also other linguistic groups which existed, such as the Ingai and Kinda, but there is no written record about them. So while we are also dealing with Southern J groups and using historical research to inform some of these experiments, they can already have been, they were probably already different. You need to be careful not to put the written source and the present into the past as like a direct Control-C, Control-V. So you need to be kind of really critical of what to choose. And in many cases, when the written sources were written about these groups, they already had different habits from what we can kind of perceive about the archaeological record. As for instance, most of them were already in contact with metal tools and were using metal tools for working bone or working wood. While at the same time, you also have continuities, such as some historical reports that say that they were using flake tools for producing bowls and like smoothing the surface of the wood. So it's kind of like really tricky ground to walk on, that we need to be really careful what we choose and how we also implement it as an experiment.
Thank you so much. Lorenza, next question is yours. The experiments on quartz are all very interesting. I hope you guys keep developing it. Have you statistically compared the experiment flakes with the archaeological ones from the Bulbocus 2? And did you conclude the archaeological ones were from bipolar flaking?
Regarding the first question, we didn't perform a statistical analysis. Our focus was more on the qualitative side. And regarding the second question, yes, we compared the archaeological flakes with the experimental ones, and we observed that there were flakes from both percussions, direct percussion with hard stone hammer and bipolar percussion. The experiment helped us to differentiate them. Thank you.
Okay, and there's a follow-up. How do you differentiate Hertz cones and bulbs observed by oblique bipolar percussion from those obtained by freehand percussion?
Actually, the Hertz cone and the bulb are the same in both types of percussion. What allowed us to identify if the flakes are from bipolar percussion and not freehand percussion is the crushing on the lower face close to the impact point.
Deborah, we have another question for you. Have there been any cores found in the archaeological record? Any refitting flakes in ongoing research?
Yes, we found some cores in our archaeological sites, but the problem was that they were very simple. We found one or two clearly extraction, so we can know very much about the chain of production of quartz in the archaeological sites. What we found in all the archaeological sites that we excavate is that people used to clean their houses, these places that we excavate, and probably in this process we lost a lot of information about the sequence of production of lithic production.
Okay, and there's a follow-up. Are all vein quartz pebbles quality the same, i.e. grain size, in the area where you selected them, or was it a variable taken into account when knapped?
Yes, there is a difference between hyaline and milky quartz, but we use only hyaline in the experimental study because we couldn't find all milky quartz quarries around the archaeological sites. So we use only hyaline quartz. But in the archaeological site, we registered milky quartz knapp.
Okay, thank you. It says, Gabriela, you said the waste material from the spatula would be used to make fish hooks. What factors led to choosing to make fish hooks of the material? Also, were there any needles made?
So yeah, I covered today, watching the videos of this Congress, that I can use the metapodials to make fish hooks, but I didn't mention that in the presentation. I used the waste material to make points. And I can say that because we see the points made by deer metapodials in archaeological sites. So I use the waste to do that, but the fish hooks, not yet, but I will try.
Okay, Lorenzo, we have a question for you. How could you improve the experiment of transforming amethyst into citrine? In other words, do you know what went wrong in your experiment? And congratulations on your work.
Thank you. We think that the main element to improve the experiment is the temperature control. We need to be able to better control the rise and fall of the temperature, mostly to avoid thermal shocks. Controlling this, we believe that we could make the experiment more successful.
Thank you. I do have a couple more questions for Enrique. When you say very simple tools about archaeological vein quartz industries found on site, do you mean unretouched flakes? And if not, what exactly do you mean by simple?
We said that very simple artifacts are those made by a few retouched on bevels. We didn't take into account the retouched flakes. We think if we can in the future make some use wear analysis to understand better the functional election or use of this material. But until now, we only understand the functional use of these artifacts by their retouched bevel. So we call it simple because it really one very simple, and sometimes there are 1 or 2 or 3 retouch only on these bevels that probably they were used.
Linda, are you answering questions for Jose and Oscar?
I can try.
Okay. Is there any evidence that these ovens were used for foods other than meats, like grains or tubers? And was it solely their equivalent of barbecue and beer?
That I wouldn't like to answer.
Perhaps Felipe, I don't know.
I believe that there is some at least written records that there would also be tubers on at least on the ethnohistory and ethnographic accounts, but I am not sure if they have been found on archaeological record.
Okay, there's a question for Enrique, Deborah, and Samira. It is not clear to me the difference between the techniques bipolar and anvil. Can you explain this difference a little more?
Yes, we try to differentiate these two techniques. Bipolar suppose the rebound in anvil, but anvil technique, we think that could avoid this rebound on anvil because we think it was used for bigger cobbles or cores that, taking into account the hardness of quartz, it was really impossible that big cores could be reduced by bipolar percussion. So what we think is that in the initial sequence of reduction, we could put the core or pebbles on an anvil and try to nap to test it or to reduce the size to continue working on by freehand or bipolar percussion. That was the difference that we found, and that was the name that we think it could be used for this type of technique. We are testing this type of techniques because of the hardness and all the problems that have quartz to reduce and obtain blanks and manufacture the instruments.
Thank you. This question is actually for Mercedes, JC, and others on stone topics. Is it hard to get the right kinds of lithic raw materials, size and quality, for your napping practice as well as your experiments? Bruce always says it takes a lot of rock to learn to nap.
Here in Brazil, we are lucky that we can have much raw material for doing these experiments. I wouldn't say that we can find a lot of good raw material because what we have the most here is actually silicified sandstone, and it's not always the best quality. However, this is exactly what they were using here, the hunter-gatherers. So that's what we have to deal with. If we want to replicate the artifacts, we have to use the same raw materials they are using. Usually, lucky for us, the raw material they were using here is mostly the raw material that the sources are very close to the archaeological sites. So we don't have to look for them in many places. We find the archaeological sites. Nearby, you have a good source of the same raw material they are using in that site. This is not always the case, but for most of the sites we're working with, we didn't have much raw material missing for those things. And for learning how to fling nap, silicified sandstone is not always the best type of rock for learning because it's so hard to get flakes if you're not good. I can say, for example, fling nappers that come from France, from Brazil to make demonstrations and etc. And we noticed that they really think it's hard to make the tools they're used to make in France because there they have those excellent flings to make those thin bifaces. And when they get here, they get the silicified sandstone. It's not easy to work with, so it's not always successful, these demonstrations. But here in São Paulo, we are lucky that we have a very good source of flint, and especially I am very lucky because I live nearby these sources. So we collect these raw materials here and we bring it to the capital, São Paulo, where the laboratory is located, and we can teach our students to fling nap with these materials.
Can I just do a follow-up question to that, Juca, which is, I'm really interested. So there are no restrictions on collecting the raw material. You have open access?
Yeah, I think the only things that we do not have full access on raw materials here is when we find out that some of these rocks, especially this flint, they're not the most silicified type of flint, but it's that fossils of trunks from
yeah.
Carboniferous. So
Yep.
when we actually find out that those are fossils, we try not to collect them anymore. But when we are not talking about rocks, we have a lot of limitation to work with bones. This is the main problem that we presented in the presentation. Yeah, we don't have much access to bones like and antlers because, well, it's forbidden to hunt here, and that's good. That's actually good. That's forbidden because deers are almost extinct, and we need a lot of deer to make these experiments. This is the most hard one. Rocks is not really hard.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Maybe we can send you some antler if you need it.
Oh, please, thank you.
Oh, Linda, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
And if anyone else is willing to send us raw material, we will be very glad to get it.
I'd just like to add a couple of things relating to João's and Linda's, is that also plants are also very difficult to find, especially if you're dealing with native plants, which are also protected by legislation. So it's quite tricky to come across those, as I have experienced myself for some of my experiments. And I really like your point that you made, João, about some of the raw materials being close to the sites that are not the best of quality, but that is what they use, because it's the same case that I had. And one of the issues I had with finding the raw material was that the quartz and the cherts were a lot less common to be found, both in the archaeological record and also to find them as for the experiments, which was really difficult. It was a lot of time walking around pebble beaches on the river Taquari to find some.
This is a question that is always pointing in these studies of raw material, that most of the times they are just collecting whatever it's near and it's flakeable, even when it's not the best thing. But it's also interesting that for some of these Paleo-Indian, Paleo-American sites in Brazil, they even choose to get the raw materials that are not the best ones, even when they live on the source of a good raw material. This is like very weird why they keep doing this. It's not always the case as well, but it's something that we are pointing out in some research.
Thank you. Juca, I do have another question for Luigi. It says, what were the main difficulties you encountered in your research, and would you do differently in future experiments?
So the first thing he's saying is that he was listening to the raw material discussion, and he's saying that's also his case. The raw material for those flaked axes is the silicified sandstone, which is the most common raw material used in Brazil. And also the flint is also common and is part of the same formation. So they're also not going very far to get the raw material. So he says that he found two difficulties in his experimentation. The first one was convincing other archaeologists that what he was seeing as used active edges, what he was seeing was marks of use and not marks of small grinding by water polishing, for example. So the second thing that was difficult to him was also to convince people, like the question I made for him, that these flaked axes are actually not preforms, but they're finished as flaked tools, because he could see that they were used, and also he could see that many of them were broken because of the use. So because they are made of silicified materials like flint and silicified sandstone, they are very fragile materials, different from igneous rocks, which are made the polished ones. So they break much more easily. And that's the reason they are break, because they were used like they are without polishing. And he's saying that what he will do different is actually something that most of us working with lithics has the same problem, which is we lack not just equipment, but also people, researchers that are actually specializing in use wear analysis, because he needed someone to help him to do the use wear of this axis. And he got some help from the team, our colleagues from Ushuaia in Argentina that helped him with this. So this is something that I think we could also talk between us, that something that people from other countries could help us with.
Thank you. I see that Alyssa's on. Your first question is, Do you think that other activities in the past, unrelated to pottery, would have provided people with the physical training required for pottery activities? Or was it something that was specialized specifically to pottery technology?
Yes, I think that every kind of movement, every kind of work that we do with our body helps us to produce anything, you know. And also our work, we talk about fire and execution of experimental fire, and of course the body and the position of the body, it can contribute to build our muscles and build our structure to do pottery. I think pottery is it's everything, you know, it's everywhere. So every kind of work that we do with our body can contribute. I think it is.
Did you have any participants who would return regularly? And did you observe an improvement in their technique or productions over time?
Sure, yes. And it's very clear to see that, you know. My students, for example, I'm a teacher, I'm a professor of pottery, and I can see very clearly the process and how my students can explore, you know, pottery and their body works, their position of body. I also see that in my own body and in my own work every day, you know. As much as I practice, I get better and better and better.
Could you elaborate on the digital social network project that you initiated during the pandemic?
We tried to bring some of our workshops and conversations about pottery and about archaeology to Instagram. Because of the pandemic, we couldn't get our reunions physically, you know, like in person. So we tried to make it online and to reach more people through Brazil and, of course, international as well. So we bring to Instagram a lot of inspirations about archaeology pottery here in Brazil, about our traditional indigenous people and all their work with pottery, to bring some inspirations and some technical knowledge to everyone. You know, everyone who's interested to know a little more about it, we can show it and we can discuss it. Also, we started a lot of videos and interviews with many different potteries around Brazil. They have reference and their work is very, very interesting. So we try to talk to these people, and internet make it easier because a lot of them are in the north, in the south. So if we do it in person, it would be difficult, more difficult than how we do it. So of course, pandemic has all of its difficulties, and we had to learn how to use Instagram to pass the information that we have. So also we had this kind of interesting thing, you know, to get in touch with people that in person it would be difficult. So I think it's a great project that we have, so we can reach more people, we can transfer our knowledge to more people. I think it's great.
Okay, good. And there's a last couple questions for you. Is it possible to observe patterns of breakage in pottery and compare them to fragments found in archaeological sites? And can these fragments inform us on manufacturing mistakes in the past?
I'm not really sure if I'm able to respond this question because I'm more pottery than an archaeologist, but I'm sure they can respond to you this question if you contact us, and I can elaborate this a little better.
All right, everyone, that was my last question from Discord and YouTube.